Sometime in 2024, fantasy burnout crept up on me, and without even realizing, suddenly it was 9 months later and I hadn't read any new adult fantasy books. Any adult fantasy books, to be honest. I'd read a couple of YA fantasy, but they were rereads, so it doesn't really count. And now, I'm very happy to say that I have read my first adult fantasy book since May of 2024. I'm finally back in a fantasy mood. This makes me very, very happy. So today I'm here to talk about Babel by R.F. Kuang. Welcome back to StoryTube. I think I was about 100 pages into Babel when I decided that I wanted to make a video about it because it just felt like the kind of book that I'd have things to say about. And that turned out to be true. And the things that I had to say evolved and changed throughout my time reading it, to the point that I have now been procrastinating making this video because I felt like I had too much to say. For some context, I have never read R.F. Kuang, but I have bought all of her books. We bought the Poppy War trilogy originally when we discovered BookTube a few years ago, and it was recommended by a lot of different channels, sounded super interesting. Never got to pick it up just because other things were being read. Then Babel came out in, I think, 2022, and the concept sounded extremely interesting. It's also a really, really beautiful book. I mean, look at this hardcover. So I bought that as well. And then a year later, I think it was, Yellowface came out. And once again, I thought the concept was super interesting. And I'm always interested when an author jumps from one genre to another as well. Happened to see a signed hardcover in our local bookshop, so I bought that as well. So I have 5 of her books on the shelves and I had not read any of them yet. So this has been a long time coming, and I ended up picking up Babel first because the premise sounds so up my alley. Unfortunately, spoiler alert for the rest of this video, it ended up being quite a mixed bag in terms of my enjoyment. This is going to be a non-spoiler review. I will touch on theme and like character names and just the general gist of the book, but it'll be non-spoilers. Positives first, and there are a good few positives. So first of all, the premise. If you don't know the concept of this book, it is set in a sort of alternative universe, Oxford, where the 19th century looks pretty much exactly the way it does in our history, but magic exists. And that magic works through translation and through the power of words. Specifically, the magic is fueled by the nuances of meaning that are lost in translation. I think that is an incredibly cool concept and a very magical one. Maybe this is a niche interest for me, growing up speaking several languages, reading in several languages, and having an interest in translation. If you want a little nugget of Yolanda lore, when I was a kid, me and my mother used to go through the Spanish book, Harry Potter books, the Spanish translations, and read the English ones in parallel because we were spotting errors in the translation and trying to correct those errors. I actually had a blog about it. And that was a very interesting experiment because some errors were very easy to correct, and then others you get into tricky territory pretty quickly, right? Because one word is not exactly equal to another in a different language. And then you go further into sentence structure and idioms and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, a rabbit hole. But I think that concept of words that are unique to certain languages, meanings that get lost in translation, connotations, certain nuances that get lost in translation, and that becoming a bit of magic is really cool, because I think that is as close to magic that as we can get sometimes in the real world. Things like that and the power that words hold. I think the idea of making this literal magic is exceptional. So starting off with that, I thought that was a great hook for me, and was just making the first probably 200 pages. This is a pretty long book. It's like, I think 540 pages in my edition. The first 200 pages, I was just swept up in this magical idea, which ties me into another positive, which is, for me personally, the writing style, like the prose itself. Now, I've talked to people who have told me that they found it boring, and I think that's fair. It's very slow. I think I wouldn't be surprised if somebody called it pretentious or meandering. I understand that. Like, I wouldn't be surprised by criticisms. For me, it really, really worked, especially because it is aiming to be dark academia. It's set in the academic setting of Oxford University. I haven't actually said what Babel is. Babel is a tower, a fictional part of the Oxford University where the translators study, and they're like very revered scholars, obviously, because it involves magic. And this setting and the whole like magic of words thing was really making the prose work for me, and it just felt quite cozy and something that I could sink into. And yeah, maybe a bit pretentious, but kind of in a good way. And I also just really like the aesthetic and the setting of the 19th century and like the Industrial Revolution, and I just really enjoy that. So just a personal thing that really worked. And then the third thing is theme. And I'm going to talk about theme a good bit in this video, but you might have guessed from the setting, and we're talking about the British Empire and academia in the British Empire in a historical setting. There's a metaphor here that R.F. Kuang is setting out to explore, which is looking at these scholars, these magical scholars, I suppose, importing people, native speakers from the British colonies in order to access more magic as a metaphor for colonialism and the exploitation of people and literal resources. Again, like the whole magic system, if you will, I think that's a super, super interesting concept that you can go really deep with, and just something pretty unique, as at least in what I have read in terms of fantasy. So I was very excited to read this book, and for the first couple of 100 pages, like I said, probably roughly 35-40% of the book, it was really working for me. However, as I was approaching the halfway point, I was saying to Carlos, I am loving this, but I don't know if that's how I'll feel when the book ends, because I feel like it's going to hinge on where we're going, because that entire first half is basically slow burn setup. Unfortunately, it kind of fell apart for me after that. And there are a couple of reasons for it. And I'm going to go into like the small ones first, because I think they're easier to check off. And then I'll get into my main issue that hindered my enjoyment. So first of all, I think even though the metaphor is really cool and the idea for the magic is really cool, I think when you start pulling on the thread, it does fall apart a little bit if you start poking too much and thinking about it too much in terms of the British Empire and the world as a whole basically looking the exact same as it did in our history, with them having magic. It's not really a perfect analogy that fully works, and I feel like you don't want to think about it too hard. There are other people and reviews that I've seen that go in more in depth criticizing that. I am not going to do that because I felt like I could stop myself from thinking about it too hard and just enjoy it anyway. That was not my main hindrance. Another kind of minor gripe is the footnotes. So this book has in-world footnotes, kind of like Nevernight, if you've read those or have heard about the footnotes there, the infamous footnotes. Now, I have nothing against footnotes. I actually quite enjoyed them. However, I thought they were used a little bit inconsistently. At times, they're there, at least actually mostly they're there to provide extra in-world context, like world building, or just giving you some more etymology lessons, which was cool. However, other times, especially I felt towards the latter half of the book, it was giving extra context of in-world plot, or what characters were doing, rather than just world building, to a point where you couldn't skip those footnotes, if that makes sense. So some footnotes you could skip because they were just giving you extra context, and then other footnotes they felt a little bit like something put in editing to fix a potential plot hole, or something that should have been mentioned earlier, and I didn't really understand why it wasn't just being mentioned earlier rather than putting it in a footnote. It felt a little bit clunky or a little bit lazy. This doesn't happen a lot, but it happens a couple of times and it just stood out to me. And then my third minor gripe is that, as cool as I thought that this magic system is, it does rely very heavily on her explaining the etymology of words to the reader. Because the way it works is that essentially there are match pairs, she calls them, between two words in two different languages that translate to each other, but there's, like I said, meaning lost in translation. But obviously the reader doesn't understand all of the languages that are being used. So every time there is one, it needs to come with an explanation of what these two words mean and why they're slightly different and what that difference is and what that then creates and means for the magic. After 500 pages of that, I felt like it kind of interfered with the momentum, especially towards the climax of the book. When moments were more tense and needed to be a little bit more fast paced, it kind of cut into that pacing, and it was a bit unfortunate. Just, I don't know how it could have been done better. It's just the nature of that magic system and how it worked. It just stopped working for me as well throughout the entire book. But like I said, all of these are kind of minor gripes that would have impacted my rating and enjoyment overall, but wouldn't have stopped me from potentially still loving the book. My main problem with this book is that it ended up treating its themes of colonialism and racism in a very simplistic way. Once the setup has been completed of our four main characters who are students at Babel, arriving in Oxford, getting to know each other, getting to know the place, getting to know the magic, once all of that is done and the plot proper gets going in the second half of the book, I thought that at every crossroad and every step of the way, the least interesting decision in terms of storytelling was made. So like I said, this is basically a book about colonialism and exploring that through the lens of magic and tied to language. So Babel, the institution, the tower, are recruiting young native speakers from their countries, which are British colonies, to come to Babel, give them a life of privilege, train them as translators, and then use them in the service of the British Empire. The plot of the book is basically a brewing revolution of these people against the British Empire and saying, I do not want to benefit the institution that is exploiting my home country and my native language, and by extension, me. Once again, I think that's a super interesting concept, and at first reading the book, I thought that it was going to explore this uncomfortable middle ground between knowing that you yourself have a lot of privilege, but also feeling like an outsider because of your race or your gender, and existing in that middle space where you don't belong to one group or the other, or you feel like you have one foot in both worlds and neither is fully yours, or wrestling with your own privilege, personal, individual privilege, while also being underprivileged because of what you look like or where you were born or who your parents are, etc. And there are hints of exploring that. Like, the main character does initially, very much like his position, enjoy being a student and a scholar and being in Oxford, but it kind of gets dropped in favor of, like I said, a very simplistic approach. So in this book, we're examining race, but we're not examining how it intersects realistically with class, with gender, with colonial oppression. I understand the motivation perhaps behind doing this. I'm speculating. I actually don't know if this is intentional or not, but if it is intentional, I can understand the motivation of saying, I do want to specifically talk about racism and racism only. This is the subject matter of this book. However, unfortunately, I think that it actually does the issue a disservice by completely isolating it from any other societal issue. We have a character who is Irish, and because of this video, I'm going to say that I do not actually remember if she's explicitly called out as Irish or if I just put that together based on her name and the language that she says she speaks, and it just is obvious that she's Irish. Ireland was also a British colony, but obviously Irish people are also white. So that's another different intersection. Another theme that gets brought in is that of class, because we have a small plot point where the silver industrial revolution, which is essentially this magic industrial revolution on top of our real industrial revolution, is putting people out of jobs. But none of these issues are examined alongside race in a way that is in any way interesting. Babel exists in a binary world where everybody that has been oppressed would join a revolution, and everybody who is on the side of the oppressor by birth would side with the oppressor in the event of a revolution. And because we're examining race and we're focusing on race, that is how it plays out in the book. And I just think that is a very simplistic and quite naive view of oppression, systemic oppression, of revolution, rebellion, and of how that would play out and has played out in the real world. It also just doesn't make for very interesting storytelling. And I want to be very clear, since I've brought in the real world into this discussion of a book, that what I'm saying is not that I wanted a more nuanced portrayal or sympathy or empathy for the British Empire as an institution. I think it's perfectly fine to characterize the institution as an objective villain of history and of this alternative history. However, I think there should be more nuanced in the characterization of individual people, either within that institution or people that are just living there at that time and happen to be attached to it in one way or another. Something that exemplifies this worldview a little bit is something that's probably going to be minor for most readers, but it's the portrayal of the Irish character. Now, there's an Irish character who is very, very minor, but it is mentioned that she's a student there and that she's studying specifically the Irish language. It's also mentioned, kind of offhand, that the match pairs have been exhausted with Irish, as of with most European languages, because a little element of the way the magic works is that if languages grow too close together, this magic starts fading because there's less meaning that gets lost in translation as the cultures come closer and closer together, which is a cool metaphor when you're looking at it in terms of, by the nature of the empire expanding and wanting to import more languages to get more magic, it will also eventually destroy the resources that it's trying to exploit. And I assume that this is how the concept was made up, through wanting a metaphor for it. And it works on a surface level, but it doesn't work in this particular case because, first of all, I don't think you can compare the Irish language with something like French or Spanish or Italian or something coming from Latin that has a lot more connections with English or any Germanic languages at the time. Irish is a very different language. It's also a language that was heavily oppressed by the British Empire, specifically at the time the book is set and shortly after the time that this book is set. So the comment of lumping Irish in with other European languages and it losing its magic because it's too close to English does not work, in my opinion, for Irish. That's a small thing of just took me out of the story for a bit because I was like, this actually doesn't make sense, but okay, whatever. It's just said in passing. There is also some potato related humor around the Irish character, and this is a very, very short scene. The Irish character cooks, boils potatoes. There's a joke made about boiled potatoes in French being called English potatoes because they're flavorless and boring. And another character says to the Irish woman, stop being so English, and we move on. Might not sound like a big deal. This book is set about 15 years before the Irish potato famine, where millions of people died or had to emigrate. The country is still not back to the population it had before the famine that happened over 170 years ago. The point I'm trying to make, I'm not saying that this should have been a book about Ireland. It's not. It's a book very much focused on the British Empire's oppression of China. That is the focus. And I'm not saying the focus should have been different. However, it's just a bit odd to me that somebody would set out to write a book that is a serious, researched critique of colonialism, of the British Empire in the 19th century, have an Irish character, have a scene like that, and not question it in any way. If there had been no Irish character at all, I feel like that would not have been an issue. It's the fact that there was one and there were throwaway comments and scenes that were just clearly a lack of research being done, which to me just takes credibility away from the book and from the story and from the really serious, interesting themes that it's trying to explore. Now, I want to be clear, and I want to be clear specifically because this is a book that focuses on race. I am not saying that this book should have focused more on white people, because that it's not what this book is trying to do, and that is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing. I'm glad that there are books out there, specifically in genre fiction and in fantasy, that maybe are reaching readers that aren't looking for that in genres where it's more prevalent, like literary fiction. I am not saying that I wanted more focus on the struggles of white people. It's a fairly innocuous thing. It's not really a big deal, but it's kind of lazy, and I think it just exemplifies the larger issues that are present in this book of just maintaining that critique very much at surface level while trying to pretend that it's very deep and meaningful. I also don't want to say that I think R.F. Kuang is a bad writer, because I think there's a great book in here. There's a potential masterpiece in here that maybe was written by an author that is still too inexperienced, by a person that is still too young. I certainly wouldn't be at a point to be able to explore issues like that in the depth that I would want to explore them with. It could be, I would not be surprised if in 10 or 15 years we get another book that's quite similar to Babel from R.F. Kuang, or exploring the same issues in a more complex way or from a different angle. The bottom line with Babel is that as I was reading it and looking back on it, I can see the mechanics, I can see the wheels turning, I can see the skeleton of the book as it was being plotted. I can see the archetype and the criticism and the societal issue that each one of the characters represents. The characters are vessels for what she is trying to say. They're not real people. So their arcs on paper sound believable, but in execution don't feel natural. And the same goes for the metaphor and the magic system. It sounds great in theory, but once you start pulling on the thread, it's just very clear what she's saying with what and why it's there. So you can see the story, you can see the building blocks, rather than it feeling like an organic thing that you're swept away with and then makes you think about these things by yourself. It's an interesting book. It's an interesting book because I think it's setting out to do something very, very ambitious because of what it sets out to do, but also it was an interesting one for me to dissect in terms of why it was working for me when it was working and why it wasn't when it wasn't. And I kept stopping myself and just asking myself a question of like, am I not liking this because I have legitimate criticisms in the craft of how it was written? Or am I not liking this because it's making me uncomfortable, because it's confronting me as a white woman with my privilege? And honestly, for that alone, the fact that there's a fantasy book out there that is setting out to do that, I'm glad that it exists. I'm glad that this kind of thing is getting published and getting the traction that it gets. Unfortunately, in my case with this book, it was making me reflect more because of the nature of the subject matter as because of the merit of this actual book writing about that subject matter. So it just ends up leaving me with a really, really interesting, very cool concept in terms of what it's trying to explore, in terms of the magic it set out to create and the world it set out to create, that just missed the mark on execution for me. So that's Babel. I read fantasy again after 9 months and I had a lot to say about it. So I am glad that I read this book, not just because it's very talked about and a popular author. It's a very interesting book to think about and talk about. I would love to know what you thought of it. If you've read it, let me know in the comments. I would also be really curious if you have any recommendations of books that you think are similar but maybe handle its themes a little bit better. Let me know. Thank you so much for watching. Like the video if you thought it was interesting. Feel free to dislike if you didn't like it. That's fine. You can consider subscribing to the channel if you're interested in hearing more, all that kind of stuff. You know the drill. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.